Last class of the semester. Okay, so we are finishing up the endocrine system today. We had hoped to do this yesterday, but for obvious reasons couldn't do it, so we will just speed through this today, get it done. This is also eligible for the final, so we're running into the finish here. We learned about the kinds of hormones and how the endocrine system works with the nervous system on Tuesday. Now we're going to discuss a bit about hormone release and a few examples of the cascading series of events that result in the release of a specific hormone and then the end result at the target tissue. So on the release side, general patterns of release are shown here, and normally hormones are released in very small bursts to maintain a certain level in the blood. And we can see a really nice depiction of that in the young individuals on this slide. The blue circles here showing the pulsatile release of growth hormone throughout the day. Individual little pulses that maintain the concentration in the blood. And this can be modified. If there's a situation of stress, the bursts can be more frequent, or the bursts can be larger. Overall, the net result will be to increase the concentration of, here, growth hormone in the blood. And the things that might modify those bursts could be nervous input, neurons that might innervate the glands specifically. Maybe they're hyperactive, prompting the release of growth hormone. Maybe there are other hormones in circulation that prompt the release of growth hormone. Maybe there's some other unexplainable reason for a change in growth hormone release. And that obviously happens. Look at the difference between the young and the old individuals. Growth hormone release is blunted in the old individuals. As you get older, you release less growth hormone. Maybe that's good, maybe it's not good. Something changes the normal release of that hormone. Some other factor in the blood. So many levels of control. But overall, pulsatile release that allows some concentration in the blood, that can vary according to various stimuli. And more often than not, that variation is due to our old friend, negative feedback. The negative feedback loop that we might have discussed in the first week of class to maintain homeostasis and correct an imbalance. And so an example of that is shown here. This is the stress response of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic-Pituitary adrenal axis. And I come back to this in one of my fourth year courses. It's not necessarily super important to remember now. It's an example of a series of cascading hormonal signals that result in an action. And what this is showing us, we're going to go into it in more detail, but first what it's showing us is there's some first signal. And here the first signal is that the hypothalamus senses a change and then turns on some nerves. The change we're looking at are glucocorticoids, and I'll talk about why that's important in a second. But we have some predetermined level that's normal, and if that value changes from normal, the hypothalamus can sense that and then adjust secretion accordingly. So we see that here. The hormones then activate the adrenal glands, so hormones from the pituitary will activate the adrenal glands, and then the adrenal glands are responsible for modifying the signal of interest, the glucocorticoids in this sense. And the most abundant and best known glucocorticoid in the body is cortisol. You know of that as a stress hormone. So this is activated in response to stress. And it's one of the reasons that, or one of the mechanisms we think plays into the development of depressive symptoms, persistent activation of this axis. And we've even seen if you have chronically high cortisol that doesn't go back down to normal, it can damage areas in the brain. They get smaller, which may or may not have implications for anxiety and depression. But that's not the point. The cascading series of events is the point. This is our typical negative feedback loop. If there are too many glucocorticoids, the system should turn off. And of course, there are only a few. The opposite feedback loop being the positive feedback loop, only a few hormones respond in this way. And the same example that I introduced at the start of the class to describe this phenomenon is used here. Oxytocin during pregnancy is released as pregnancy starts in response to stretching of the cervix and accumulates until the stretching stops, which happens when the child is born. So positive feedback, only a few hormones react in this way. Most of them respond via a negative feedback loop. So notice the cascade. We'll come back to this a few times. A nerve prompts a gland to release a hormone. That hormone travels to a second gland to affect change or release another hormone, and the cascade continues as such. Now let's talk about one gland in particular, what used to be referred to as the master gland, the pituitary gland, which seemed to control all other glands in the body, but it itself is a slave to the actions of the hypothalamus. And this is interesting because it's one of the most well-defined points of connection between the nervous and endocrine system. I mentioned how these work in tandem to control responses in the body. Nervous, obviously via nerves and action potential, nervous firing. And the endocrine system via hormone release. This is where they connect. The hypothalamus has nervous input to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland in turn releases hormones. Now the structure of the pituitary gland is generally divided as such, anterior and posterior, and the connection to the hypothalamus is via the infundibulum, a fun word that you learned in lab early in the course. And we'll look at these in a little bit of detail today. So neural pathway, the transmission of nervous signals through the infundibulum, and then these two, they look like elf shoes for lack of a better descriptor, are responsible for releasing hormones into the blood. Now, the anterior lobe of the pituitary is where the majority of hormones are synthesized and released. The anterior lobe synthesizes and releases 7 hormones. And I emphasize that because the posterior pituitary doesn't synthesize. The anterior pituitary makes hormones. 7 of the 9 hormones are produced here. It accounts for about 3/4 of the weight of the pituitary gland, and the rest is made up by the posterior lobe. 2 hormones are stored here and released, but they're not synthesized. And I'll show you the major players. We'll look at a few examples of how these hormones work, but it won't be an exhaustive list. So it would be nice if you had an on-off switch that prompted the anterior pituitary to release a hormone. That would be great. But I'm emphasizing to you the cascade of signals for a reason. There are some hormones that respond in that way. A nerve turns on, the hormone is released. But the majority are in the middle of this cascade of events, where an upstream hormone acts on the anterior pituitary cells and prompts the release of a secondary downstream hormone. And this cascade continues throughout the body. So So the hypothalamus does have some direct nervous input, but it also is responsible for itself releasing hormones. And we call these, they're still hormones, but we call them inhibiting hormones or releasing hormones for the actions they have at the pituitary. And they are focused. Their actions are focused really nicely through this hypophyseal portal system. And what that means is blood flow connects the hypothalamus and the pituitary directly. Anything released from the hypothalamus can't go anywhere else. This portal system ensures that it goes directly to the pituitary gland. And we see that portal system shown here. On the right-hand side, the anterior side of the slide, you can see the anterior lobe of the pituitary. You can't see the hypothalamus, but you can imagine it up here with the infundibulum connecting the two. And the portal system are these two plexuses, the networks, the mesh capillary beds that allow easy passage of substances in and out of the blood. So just following the flow of blood, you can see arterial blood coming in here in the superior plexus. It perfuses the entire plexus, picks up anything produced at the hypothalamus, and travels immediately inferiorly and does the same thing at the pituitary gland. There's no escape. And it's this directed blood flow that allows this hierarchy in function. Blood flows from arteries to veins through capillaries. And we're going to spend a lot of time on this next semester when we talk about the cardiovascular system. And maybe this is not news, but this is how arteries connect to veins in the body, through these meshwork of capillary beds, exactly like this. They don't stop and start, they blend together. And because the anterior pituitary is downstream from the hypothalamus, anything released by the hypothalamus is sensed there first. There's no opportunity for it to be broken down. There's no opportunity for it to go anywhere that it's not supposed to go. It goes directly from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And you can follow, you can trace the flow just like such, like this. There's no connection between the anterior and posterior plexuses on this slide. Unidirectional flow, we'll call it. Actually, the whole cardiovascular system is unidirectional flow, but we'll get there. So let's take a look at why this was called the master gland. What's so special about the pituitary gland? Let's take a look at some of the sequence of events in the release of some of these hormones, and I'll point out a few that are important. So what you'll notice on this slide, we're pulling back and adding a bit more detail now. You see the portal system and the blood flow is in place. What's the first signal that initiates hormone release at the pituitary gland? It comes from the hypothalamus and from these really unique neurons. We call them neurosecretory cells. And you can argue to me, and I would buy it, that really all neurons are neurosecretory cells. The thing that they secrete normally is acetylcholine. And you know that from your study of the neuromuscular junction and synapses. They secrete acetylcholine. Well, these are different. They secrete other things. Not acetylcholine, but inhibiting and releasing hormones. So these specialized neurons are activated for some reason, and they release inhibiting and releasing hormones into the portal system. They enter the blood whenever the nerves depolarize, just like acetylcholine would. They're stored in vesicles at the end, and then when the action potential arrives, they're released, just like a normal synapse. These enter the blood, and because this portal system goes directly to the pituitary gland, they're carried into this inferior hypophyseal plexus that covers the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And it's here that the inhibiting and releasing hormones, they reach their target cells. Right? Our understanding of how hormones work is that they're released from somewhere and they affect a target cell somewhere in the body. Well, here, the path between those 2 points is very short. The target cells in the anterior pituitary respond. They release hormones in response to whatever is delivered to them in the blood, and then those hormones flow out of the venous drainage through the heart and to the rest of the body. Their target cells are a bit further away. So we have a nerve being stimulated, inhibiting or releasing hormones being released, and then hormones in the anterior pituitary that release the hormones of action into the circulation. And some of those, well, all of those are shown here, but some of them that are important are growth hormone that we talked about. That's released from the anterior pituitary. You'll see it referred to as GH or HGH, or called growth hormone. And there isn't an easy way to remember this, but growth hormone is released from somatotrophs. There's not an easy way to remember that. But it has a large role in helping bones and muscles and cartilage and tendons grow during development. Pretty widespread effects, very important for development. Different kind of development are hormones that affect reproduction, which is coming in the second half of the course as well. These hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, are involved in the production of sperm and oocytes, or eggs, in women. These are a bit easier to remember. The gonadotrophs secrete these hormones as they target the gonads. Easier to remember that name. And I thought I would throw this up here too, because the cascade of events in the HPA axis that we just talked about is located here as well. Corticotrophs secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is the link between the pituitary and the adrenal gland that eventually releases cortisol. Corticotrophs release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which makes sense. They activate the adrenal glands. They come from the corticotrophs. It's in the name. And even the name of the hormone describes the action. And so if you have this down, these are the hormones that are released from the pituitary, but the signal coming from the hypothalamus is a little bit different. Growth hormone responds to growth hormone releasing hormone, or it responds to growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Now the names make a bit more sense, a bit easier to remember. Or adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone is what comes from the hypothalamus to stimulate the pituitary. So these individual cells, the target cells of different colors shown here, are specific. They only release and synthesize one kind of hormone. They only respond to one type of upstream releasing or inhibiting hormone, and they all drain into the circulation to activate all of these distal tissues. Notice that they are varied, widespread effects. They activate other glands. They change the activity of muscle. They influence the growth rate of bone, the testes, throughout the body, widespread hormonal effects. So I mentioned to you that most hormones respond via negative feedback loops, and I'm not going to ask you, okay, what types of cells respond to negative feedback loops in the anterior pituitary. You can write this down, but I'm not going to ask you that. I just want you to notice the levels of control here on the negative feedback loop side. So this is the HPA axis all over again. The hypothalamic-pituitary adrenal axis. We've seen adrenocorticotropic hormone that travels to the adrenal glands to release cortisol. And usually, if there's enough cortisol circulating, if you get stressed enough, cortisol will turn off secretion of ACTH here at the pituitary, and it shuts off the hypothalamus. Shuts off corticotropic releasing hormone and ACTH, overall decreasing the amount of cortisol circulating in the blood, or it should. Nothing new here, just illustrating these two levels of control. Growth hormone is another good example. Probably it's the most abundant anterior pituitary hormone in the body and has massive widespread effects. And this is one that we're still trying to decipher. It has varied actions in the body. You'd think it would universally be good. There's some indication now that it's not necessarily good. So HGH, the most plentiful anterior pituitary hormone, and it's also involved in its own cascade. It activates widespread tissues in the body through insulin-like growth factors. Insulin-like growth factors. And depending on the kind or the amount, it can target bone specifically, or tendon, or muscle, or cartilage. And we're not going to get into those details. But we already saw that it's released in bursts. I showed you that trace. And I already mentioned to you that, like the other hormones in the anterior pituitary, it responds to inhibiting and releasing hormones. Growth hormone releasing hormone, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So usually in times of stress, growth hormone is released. In times of plenty, it's turned off, which seems a little bit backwards. This is a really interesting pathway because as we begin to decode the aging process, I don't know if you've ever thought about why you get older. If you have an answer, that's great. Nobody knows why bodies age. No one knows. It seems that it's a program, that it's done on purpose. And these IGFs, the insulin-like growth factors, are one of the mediators that make you get older. And the less you have, I'm going to say the younger you stay, but that's not exactly true. There's some really fascinating stuff in this area. So growth hormone plays a large role in lifespan, as well as normal development of muscle, bone, and tendon. Incidentally, if you've ever heard of someone or you've tried injecting human growth hormone before, by far, the largest response to injecting human growth hormone is an increase in muscle tendon size. You can take tendon biopsies like you would muscle biopsies, and tendons get bigger. Bone doesn't really respond, muscle doesn't really respond, but tendons get bigger. So if that's what you're going for, by all means, use HGH, but certainly not an effect that many people that set out with it are aiming for, at least. And so, like the HPA axis, growth hormones cascade is shown here. Whenever there's some stress, maybe it's famine, maybe it's studying for a final exam or having to alternate your schedule to come in on a Saturday for your lab exam, growth hormone releasing hormone is induced, and so growth hormone's released. And on the flip side, whenever there is a surplus or abundance, you've been to McDonald's twice that day, you didn't go to the gym, you're feeling really relaxed and sedentary, growth hormone is decreased, or its release is prevented or blunted in the blood. And I know this seems backwards. If growth hormone is supposed to increase muscle growth and grow bones, why wouldn't you do it in times of abundance and surplus? It seems backwards. I don't have a good answer for you right now, but we'll just leave it at that. But overall, if growth hormone is present in the circulation, its actions are shown here. Generally, it helps to reduce protein breakdown, proteolysis, helps preserve those gains, activates osteoclasts, osteoblasts to help build bone, and enhances fat oxidation, which spares things like protein and glucose for other more important roles. Helps the body to rely on fat as a fuel. So these are a couple examples, two major examples that we looked at in more detail of hormones from the anterior pituitary. What about the posterior pituitary? You don't have to remember all the individual cascades, just the two main examples that we've gone through on the anterior side. Posterior pituitary, less of a role, but not unimportant. It's responsible for releasing only 2 hormones, not 7. Only 2 hormones. And those are oxytocin, which we've talked about, the classic example of a positive feedback loop, and antidiuretic hormone, which some of you might run into problems with this weekend. I'll talk about that in a second. Heard some people down here making some bad life choices about extracurricular plans before the lab exam tomorrow morning. Antidiuretic hormone comes into play there. It's slightly different because the posterior pituitary doesn't synthesize hormones. Instead, those neurosecretory cells from the hypothalamus extend all the way down into the posterior pituitary and release hormones directly into the blood. So the neurosecretory cells over here send oxytocin and send antidiuretic hormone into the posterior pituitary, where they are released into the inferior hypophyseal portal system. That was the second plexus on the left-hand side of the slide. That wasn't connected to the first one we discussed. Now, the name for this bundle is the Hypothalamic-Hypophyseal Tract. Tract, we know, is a bundle of nerves. It simply means that these nerves extend all the way down in the posterior pituitary. And you can see on this similar diagram how hormones are released in the posterior pituitary. Instead of activating upstream hormone release and that cascading down to the pituitary gland, we have direct activation via these neurosecretory cells. So, in this process, number 1, hormones are synthesized in those neurosecretory cells, and they travel to the terminal end bulbs and are released much like acetylcholine is in response to depolarization. So oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone, are contained within the ends of those nerves. Those vesicles at the end store the hormone and are responsive to depolarization. When those neurons depolarize, the hormones are released. And because the ends of those neurons are in such close proximity to the inferior hypophyseal plexus, upon depolarization, hormones enter the bloodstream directly. So whenever we need oxytocin, it's released into the bloodstream directly and transmitted through the body. Same thing about antidiuretic hormone. Now I'll give you a brief word on what each of these hormones does and why they're important before we summarize and call it a day. Notice the important difference here, okay? Hormones secreted directly from the neurosecretory cells enter the blood. So oxytocin, we've already discussed in the context of pregnancy and childbirth. It's also referred to as the cuddling hormone. It's released in response to stretch placed on the cervix. That's the prime example, the classic example of the positive feedback loop. And then when there's more in circulation, it enhances the strength of contraction until the stretch on the cervix is gone. It has other secondary effects which are important for childbirth and weaning in helping the production of milk at the breasts in response to mechanical stimuli. So not just stretch at the cervix, but other mechanical stimuli can release oxytocin as well. The role is unclear, but we also release oxytocin in men and in non-pregnant women. It has roles outside of simply childbirth, and we generally believe it to be involved in some sense, various degrees of fondness or intimacy or connection in a relationship between two people. That's the best that we have right now, at least. So oxytocin, the cuddle hormone. You would think that the two hormones released from the posterior pituitary would have similar effects, but couldn't be further from the truth. Antidiuretic hormone literally means hormone that stops you from peeing, hormone that stops urination or stops diuresis. And this is a very important hormone in regulating blood pressure. And the picture in the background will become clear shortly. Hormone that prevents diuresis. ADH responds via a negative feedback loop to changes in blood pressure. So let's just get this straight first. Antidiuretic hormone, if it's there, you won't experience diuresis. If it's there, it prevents you from releasing too much fluid. If it's not there, well, you don't have that break in place. If it's not there, you will experience diuresis. You will release a lot of fluid. So, for the majority of the day, you want there to be sufficient antidiuretic hormone circulating. You don't want a quick drop in the middle of anatomy class, right? You want it to be there to prevent diuresis. If blood pressure goes up, that's a signal that says, hold on, we have a lot of fluid. We have a lot of fluid. There's a lot of blood volume. We need to get rid of some fluid. Well, okay, if we have high blood pressure, the signal is to impede or blunt ADH, to decrease ADH in solution in the blood. That means the brake is gone and you release fluid. Blood pressure comes back down to normal, which should be a good thing. And the opposite is true as well. If blood pressure drops, if you're dehydrated, you're experiencing hemorrhage, you don't want to get rid of excess fluid because you need it to maintain blood volume in the body. And so you start to produce ADH drastically. So without ADH, urine output increases maybe even tenfold. And the classic theory, the classic view on ADH was that alcohol is an ADH inhibitor. Alcohol, when taken in, decreases circulating ADH. All of a sudden you don't have that break, and so you will experience diuresis. You will release fluid. The phenomenon of breaking the seal, quote unquote. Generally thought to be a result of a severe blunting in ADH production as a result of alcohol ingestion. But I say used to because that's not the going theory anymore. And people used to ascribe all the bad feelings of hangovers to a lack of ADH and then dehydration over the course of a night, but that's not the case. At least our understanding has changed a little bit thanks to these two fellows. These are a pair of twins that work for the BBC, or not work for the BBC. They're both doctors and were contracted by the BBC in London to do a special on alcohol. And their whole premise was to compare binge drinking versus regular drinking. And right now, I think, what's the going rate? 3 units a day is acceptable alcohol intake. Unit being a shot of something or a beer, right? So these twins, hopefully having the same physiology, or at least similar physiology, compared binge versus normal drinking. So one of the twins drank 21 units in a night. The other twin drank 3 units every day for a total of 21 units a week. Both drank the same amount of alcohol. And they measured urine production, as you can see here. This is a collection of their urine on that binge night. So the twin drinking 3 units kept up by drinking just orange juice. And wouldn't you know it, the amount of urine produced was the same. Which kind of flies in the face of convention. We thought, well, antidiuretic hormone is inhibited, so you're going to release a lot more fluid. But it turns out if you drink a lot of fluid, there's a lot to release anyways. I'll leave you with a thought before we summarize. Do you want to know the reason for hangovers that they found in this study? It turns out alcohol has some pretty potent effects on the intestines, and it makes the intestines more permeable. That means more leaky. And so what's happening on a good binge drinking night is you make your intestines really porous, and a lot of the bacteria in your intestines leak out into the bloodstream. It's like minor sepsis. And so I always tell my 4th years this, when they're absent on November 3rd or November 4th because it's 1 month to X-ring, I tell them, you're literally full of shit right now. Makes the intestines more porous. And we can measure that in the blood. There are certain cytokines and endotoxins that are present when your intestines are leaky. So have fun tonight. All right, let's wrap it up. We've had a very brief look at the endocrine system. It doesn't do it justice, but we have the main characteristics and the important points down. The endocrine system and the nervous system coordinate bodily responses in tandem. They cooperate. And generally the nervous system is the acute, short-lived feed-forward signal. And the endocrine system is the delayed more persistent, chronic signal. But they work in tandem to bring about changes in bodily function. Most of the hormones that we discussed are circulating hormones. There are other types, but most are circulating. And so they're released from a gland, they travel through the blood, and they affect a target tissue somewhere else in the body. Excuse me. We saw an example today where that distance was very short, and we saw an example today where that distance is quite long, between the pituitary and the kidneys. Hormones can have a myriad of different actions at those target tissues. And in general, there are two main classes. Lipid-soluble hormones can pass right through plasma membranes, but they need to be chaperoned in the blood or in the cell. The water-soluble hormones need receptors. They bind to receptors on the surface of the cells, but can dissolve freely in blood if they want to. And lastly, we started to scratch the surface of how complicated the series of steps involved in hormone release and the ultimate effect of the target tissues are. Hormones are released in response to other hormones. They're released in response to neural signals. And then they might prompt a secondary class of hormones to be released or activate target tissues directly. And not to mention that at the target tissue, the specific effect can be modified by what type of hormone is released, what receptors are present, if there's a lot of receptor present, or if other hormones are fighting for those receptors and pushing the original signal, the original hormone, out of the way. So many ways that we can vary and grade the response. Any questions before we call it for the day?